Oh, hey. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Oh, good. Second.
Sound good?
Yeah, now is good. I don't know if I don't know if you can see, but everyone's here.
Hi, everyone.
Should I blow up this screen?
Sure.
Okay.
So I prepared some slides. So let's see how this format works. Usually when I give lectures, I'm like there in space and I can see the people who are listening. And now I kind of have to believe that you're there. But maybe you can make some sound so I can know you're there.
Oh, let's make some sound, I guess.
That counts as proof. Thank you, Laurel, for asking me to give a small presentation. As far as I understood, your class is about programming is writing.
Yep.
And so I was looking for some connections to my practice, which are certainly there. And I think I'm going to speak like about for half an hour, and maybe we can have questions afterwards. So it's almost 8 here. I'm in Berlin. It's already dark outside. It's getting colder. And, so I'm going to talk about programming as writing in relation to my own practice. And I'm going to show some slides, which, like I said, is like about half an hour, and also maybe show you a little bit of video. And my connection to writing is I'm primarily more like a visual or conceptual artist, and the writing came slowly later. It kind of sneaked in, and mostly it started in writing as metadata, in the sense that I would make an artwork and then people ask me, so what is the title of the artwork? Which is really a strange question, because why should an artwork even have a title? But then to index it and to catalog or archive it, you kind of need titles. So I started to make titles, but then the titles became more important and maybe even like changing the work or destabilizing the work. So this is a very early work made in 2009. It's almost 10 years old. I'm getting old. But it was called Painting with Mousepad. And somehow when somebody wrote about this writer, he only wrote about the title and then only looked at the work. So I figured that this metadata, or this way that you kind of declare the work with a word, is quite powerful. And so I wanted to first talk about speech acts. Who is familiar with the concept of speech acts? I don't hear anything, or maybe nobody, or everybody's just silent. And another way of talking about them is calling them performative utterances. And I'm sure you're familiar with this term. I think it was the philosopher Austin who made this really an important concept. And he defined this idea of the, and I really don't know how to pronounce this, which is kind of ironic, but I think it's all illocutionary. Well, maybe that's the British way of saying it, I don't know. But it's this idea that whenever you say something, where you describe something in the world, or you're trying to communicate something that is in the world, that there's often another layer behind it, which is actually has a direct impact on the current situation. So in this example, when somebody says there's a snake under you, what this person means is not necessarily to tell you that, like, how interesting is it that there's a snake under your chair, but more like, watch out and get away. So this speech act is actually a warning, immediately mobilizing you to take action. And these performances these performative utterances, and I just copy paste this from Wikipedia, of course, but I find them very fascinating because they're not necessarily true or false. They don't necessarily can be judged for their value of truth or false, but they are more to directly intervene in reality and change the social reality of the people hearing your performative utterance. And also one of the things that is mentioned here is that it's not so much about true or false, but when something is wrong with this utterance, then we say that this is an unhappy utterance. And if nothing is wrong, it's happy. And then point 2 is sort of what I already said, that beyond just the sole method of communication, a particular part of information, they have this double layer of directly changing the situation. So I'm sure you're familiar with this situation when knights were, or like when normal people were declared to be knights. Then, I mean, I don't know who this woman is, but at this moment she says something like this, like, at this moment, here and now, I declare you to be a knight. So this is not telling him that he could be a knight or giving him a compliment or something, but by saying these words, almost like a magical, like a spell, the social reality changes. So this guy who's kneeling, the moment she says this, he is actually a knight. So her words have this direct impact. And more in a contemporary situation, like when people get married, so hereby I declare you man and wife, or husband and wife, then actually this guy is not informing the people that they are dead. No, he's actually, his word has some kind of almost like metaphysical impact on reality. Like the state of the situation changes. And I think what is important here to realize is that in the case of declaring somebody to be a knight, or declaring to people to be married, is that these people don't actually change themselves, but it's more the reality around them, the way they perceive, the way they are judged by from outside towards them. So they're more the subject or victim of that situation. And this is quite similar to how the New Testament starts, where it's kind of, I mean, it's the first part of the New Testament, but then it's kind of referring to Genesis, when the world was made, that this performative utterance by God to declare the world to be there actually caused the world to be there. And this gives quite a lot of power to language. And this is not so surprising, of course, because the Bible where this was written in was also written. So somehow they would have favored language. So now I'm jumping to now, and I don't know, because your class is called Programming as Writing, right? And so how many of you do actually program?
We're getting into it.
You're getting into it. Good, because I mean, this is just a small code fragment. It's just a stupid example, but it's in Ruby. What language are you going to program in?
We're starting with HTML, CSS, then JavaScript, then PHP.
Okay, great. So this must not look that weird then. So in this case, you have a variable called foo, and it's assigned value, which is a string, and it's all capitals. And then there's this method called on this variable called downcase, And the exclamation mark is important here, because just this instruction, foo, dot, downcase, exclamation mark, effectively changes the value of this string. So then puts foo means like write this piece of text to the computer so you can see it, and the result is like it's there in the white box, so it's a string, so it's all lowercase, which is an imperative command, which is a bit like this locutionary use of language. And in programming, you could also have this alternative situation where the code is very similar, but if you see bar is foo dot downcase, you see that there is no exclamation mark. And this also means that the output is not the same. So actually, when it's showing the value of foo, it's still all uppercase. Anyway, let's not nerd out here. But I found this distinction interesting, and so I found it interesting that language both has this function of conveying the information at hand, the supposed content of what is being communicated, but also at the same time has this other layer of effectively and directly changing the situation. And now I'm making kind of a jump to my own work, because I'm really not a writer, and I find it very difficult to write. I don't really know why, but I do appreciate reading, and I mean, this is like I was collecting all these fragments when I got my Kindle, like 2010 or something. And the Kindle was kind of an interesting device for me. And you know the e-reader, right? The Amazon Kindle. Mm-hmm. Because if I would be reading texts, mostly philosophy, which I barely understood, then it was not so much about actually reading the philosophy and understanding it, even though I was also trying that, but it was more about going through these texts by philosophers that I kind of thought that I should understand, by just finding fragments that I thought that made sense, or that were interesting, or maybe potentially material to use. So I was collecting all these fragments, and you can really easily collect text by just highlighting it. And by highlighting a piece of text from an ebook, also other people could see what you were highlighting, and it would automatically store all your highlights on a server somewhere. So after a while, you could go through your highlights. And at these times, I might have been reading maybe 3 different books at the same time, and the highlights were all shown chronologically from the different sources. So the different sources were kind of mixed, and just my highlights became sort of a new, well, not story, but a new text, which is, I don't really like the reference, but maybe it's a bit like William Burroughs, who was cutting pieces of paper and composing new stories with that. So I've been publishing these kind of fragments on this system called dissociation. I'm not going to read the whole text now, but I can send the slides later if you want. And I thought it was just kind of funny because the answer to the question was actually an advertisement. Is anybody familiar with the difference between langue and parole? Like, who speaks French there? It's very quiet now.
Does anyone speak French?
Yes.
Because this difference between langue and parole, but then also the difference between spoken language and written language, is kind of the thing all these French philosophers were kind of masturbating on for a long time. in particular Derrida, who spent so much time in describing the difference between written language and spoken language. So early on I spoke about the speech acts, where if you say something, that it directly influences reality. But in our contemporary situation, I don't know about you, but I find myself much more engaged with language in written form. And I mean, of course, I speak all day with people, but that is a lot, it carries a lot less reflection from my part than when I write. When I write, it's emails, but it's chats, and I read back the chats, and they have a very dominant role in my life, but also in my artistic life. And I feel, and this is also something that Derrida and other philosophers have been saying a lot about, this possible hierarchy between spoken word and written word. So these writing acts. Did I press the right button? Yes. I'm also not going to read these quotes, but this one may be interesting because these are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 highlights from different things I was reading, but somehow subconsciously my attention decided what parts of which publications I would be reading, and then again by my decision on what parts to highlight, what parts were relevant for me, even if I didn't really know why they were relevant or what in particular the thing was that I was trying to figure out. I was kind of constructing my own text, which again, I might not call it narrative, but there is some kind of order or chronologic system. And gradually while reading, so I was reading websites, but also ebooks, and then when I would look back a bit later, like a few days later, and see what I had been reading or what parts I thought were relevant, then unconsciously the thing that I was really looking for emerged from this activity. And this is for me a very important mode to be in, which is consuming content from different sources, not for the sake of understanding it or remembering it, but more as like a harvesting attitude of seeing not what is true, but what is potentially interesting. And I'm also definitely not the only one doing this, and this is a short fragment that Laurel was also interested by. I think I posted it once on Instagram. It's by Georges Louis Borges. I say his name wrong. Anyway, but I would like to make it clear that if any ideas are to be found in what I write, that those ideas came after the writing. I mean, I began by the writing, I began by the story, I began with the dream, if you want to call it that, and then afterwards, perhaps, some idea came of it. But I didn't begin, as I say, by the moral and then writing a fable to prove it. And I was really happy to find this piece of text because it's really similar to the way I read things. I'm very fascinated by philosophy, but I very often feel that I'm not really capable of understanding it all. But there are just a few pearls in this massive amount of complicated academic literature that kind of scares me. But if I approach it in this mode, where it's just to find these pearls, then it feels quite productive. And so and this was very important in making the Kindle highlights, because it was not even so much the fact that I was highlighting a particular piece of text, but it was also social. So other people could see what I had been highlighting, and people could even comment on the things that I was highlighting. So then you get into this kind of feedback loop where also the response by other people, you take it maybe even also unconsciously into account. And so I turned that into a work. I think this was made in 2011, where I was asked to show 3 collages in an exhibition in a museum in Rome. And they didn't really tell me what the show was about or what kind of work they were looking for. So then I thought, well, let's just take screenshots of all the different collages I make over the course of about 2-3 months and combine those screenshots with the things that I've been reading in the same time frame, and also the music that I've been listening to in the same time frame. And then I programmed some kind of software that, based on these timestamps of the text and the images and the music, would generate some kind of movie. And I can show you a fragment of it. I don't know if the music comes through. You can hear my voice, but I don't know if you can hear the sound that my laptop makes. Oh, I can send you also the link to this video. I think I put it on Vimeo or YouTube at some point. I really don't know what the image quality is when you see these things over there, or the sound.
Looks pretty good. Yeah, we'll watch it later.
Yeah, it was acceptable. And so one of the things that was important for me was when I had all these highlights and I had them in a particular order compiled by a few, actually there were also PHP scripts that aggregated the different sources, and then putting them in order, they still required a lot of rewriting for them to make more sense. And at some point I was rewriting them so much that the connection to the original sentence was kind of lost. And that I quite liked. And I also don't have source, at the end I don't have credits for all the people who, the quotes that I used. I think they've become sufficiently detached from their origin that it has become something on its own. And a similar attitude I had when I was keeping a diary. And I don't know about you guys, but like very often when there's birthday parties of family, like aunts and uncles, and you have to go, and it's kind of not always the most preferable social situation, so I kind of end up in a corner and just look at people. And then I made some notes about things that I saw. And also these notes, I mean, the moment you write a note, besides the note, you have also this metadata of when you did it. And that is maybe even equally important because of this timestamp, you have the notes have an order and you can place them in time. And I also compiled these short small scribblings that I made in social gatherings like birthday parties, and turned it into a screensaver, I think. I wonder if the screen sharing works when I start a screensaver, but it should turn black and you should see some graphics and some text. So scream if it doesn't happen. And in this case, like the graphics, the kind of like lo-fi graphics are generated partially random by a generative algorithm that uses L systems, and L systems are often used in natural language processing. So it's like a very kind of mathematical approach to understanding how people speak. And even though that has given us some insights, if you compare those insights from the very loose, intuitive, like emotional things that I wrote, you have this big gap still between, let's call it artificial intelligence, and human emotions. And I thought it was kind of interesting to have them overlap. So it goes on for quite a long time, this screensaver. I think Laurel has a copy of it.
Yeah. I think maybe you've seen it before, right?
So I've been like speaking for half an hour already. But so the important point that I wanted to make was to compare the speech acts, which are about spoken word. And there's been a lot of philosophical discourse around this, mostly from continental philosophy, about speech and the meaning of speech, and this double layer of performative utterances, where the actual thing you say carries this additional layer that is actually a commandment, which has a direct impact on the real world. And I wanted to compare these speech acts to writing acts, and in particular consider writing as an activity that is not as it used to be in book form, where you would work on it isolated, and when it's done you publish it, but where the publishing is continuous. And we are really familiar with this, of course. Everybody writes on Facebook. I mean, I don't anymore, but you get into these feedback loops, which can also be totally tantalizing, or more like suffocating. But in a way also very stimulating for me. But I was then also using platforms that I developed myself that didn't have the same reward structures as the likes or the retweet. And I turned this performative publishing into, it helped me to, instead of figuring out in advance what my message was, because I don't actually directly know, but then instead use the act of writing as a tool to figure out slowly, gradually, and looking at your unconscious, to figure out what the thing might possibly be that you want to convey, instead of figuring out in advance and then just communicating it. And I guess this distinction and this analogy was the thing I was wondering how you feel about that, and if that makes sense, and if you have questions about this.
Cool, thanks.
I'm going to switch the camera on because then it's less anonymous. Stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay, so does anyone have questions? And I thought maybe if anyone does have questions,
We have to reload. Let's see.
if you could just come to the computer and ask Harm, because it will be easier for him to see.
It seems like my camera doesn't work anymore, so I'm going to restart the browser. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions? Yeah?
I guess I was wondering about in the example of the digital collages, you mentioned that you sort of had these pieces of language that ultimately you kind of transformed into something that was different from the source material. I'm curious about what that process was like. I guess at the moment I'm sort of working on something similar, but I'm interested in keeping it very true to the extracted language, very true to the source material. But yeah. It sounds nice.
It's a very good question, because many of my projects have this generative quality to them. So I create some system or situation and output some content, and there is this trend in generative graphics that says no, the algorithm has to do it all for you. You have to stay true to the algorithm and keep this process clear and open. And I am cheating a lot. And this is very important. And maybe you know the collages of Hans Arp. It's like a super uncool Dada reference I'm making, but I kind of like it. So what he did was, instead of deciding on the composition himself, he threw pieces of paper on a larger paper, and that was supposed to define the composition. But then people were looking at those collages and they figured out that actually he re-glued them quite often. And so this could be considered cheating, but I don't think so. And in the same way, because the algorithms themselves already carry so much of my own, all these micro decisions and how these systems work, that they were never objective from the start anyway.
Were you rewriting them to sort of fit together more as a...
Yeah, or I might change the order, because in the end, for me, it's about harvesting this unconscious, still linear story or text, and the more I can help the thing that wants to come out, the story that wants to come out, or the meaning that wants to come out, the more I can help it to be stronger, I will do it. Because it was not for me to show how amazing algorithms are. Or, no, it was about figuring out something almost like reverse engineering. What was there to begin with and letting it out. Sounds a bit like a hippie now. You know what I mean?
It's a nice story about the art collages, the Hans Arp collages.
No, cheating.
Thanks.
Yes.
Anyone else? Okay.
What's the most surprising or unexpected thing you've discovered through the process of writing?
Yeah. That is that for us human beings, at least for me, it is very difficult to do something truly random or meaningless. And sometimes I think I do something really random, but then when I look back later, it still really fits the format that I only started to understand later. And this is quite surprising, because if you have like mathematical randomness, if you throw the dice, you have true randomness. But we human beings, I mean, if you ask a human being to give a random number under 10, most of the time they say 3, and then they say 7. And this is pretty much the same all over the world. And yeah. Is that the answer?
Any other questions? Anything else? Yeah?
So you was mentioning that when with the speaking language, like actually sometimes when you speak this, it doesn't actually mean this. Like there's a snake, it actually means watch out. So is there any kind of like similar thing in the writing language?
Yes, and that was to some extent something I was trying to make clear, that when I write, it is not so much to convey a thought that I have in my head to other people, but the act of writing, in particular when it's shared, published while I do it through social media, is much more about me figuring out what I want to say in the first place. So, I mean, it's a bit like a skewed or like a fake analogy to the speech act. But if you have this double layer in speech act, for me, they are also in writing act, where I really don't write things for other people to read them. I mean, this is also not, but I write them to actually figure out the thing that I had in my mind. It's a bit like psychoanalysis, but then without the therapy.
Thank you.
To follow up on that, would you say that like the way that making visual art has a parallel, that you make some things to figure out what you're trying to say? Or is it a different relationship?
No, it's very much similar, and I have great respect for artists who know what they want to say. I don't know. And I would rather stand on the same side as the spectators to be kind of surprised. And I think just the engaging with materials, be it text or found footage or just thoughts, and that this continuous engagement with the material, reconfiguring it, editing it, changing it, layering it, and then gradually something comes out of this, is for me much more productive. So in that sense, I'm a strange conceptual artist, because usually conceptual artists start with a concept, an idea of what they're going to do. And for me, it starts more with some kind of gut feeling that I think, oh, this could potentially be somehow interesting, but I don't really know how yet.
Thanks.
Any others?
Thanks so much, Harm. That was great.
No question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you later.
I'll send you the slides if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Good. Nice to see you. I didn't see the whole class, could you? That's nice. So it's like
I think it's like 16 actually.
16.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for paying attention. much love for Berlin.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye. Yay. Cool. That was fun.